Welcome to So Very Easy. My name is Laura, and today we are going to continue the block of the month, and it's block 4. Now this has been a free follow along pattern from Quilting Confections, and there is a free download for you so that you can follow along. I'll put a link in the description and you can print out all of the patterns and follow along. Let's get started with block number 4. I've been doing the block of the month in 2 different colorways. The one that comes with the pattern, which is this beautiful sorbet color, and it is called Rainbow Sorbet. The next color variation, I've been using scrap fabric, and I've also done them reverse. Where we've had the light, I'm putting the dark. I've started with a very dark floral, and then from there I'm pulling out all of my scraps to make each block. I start with my one color, and then as I'm doing all of my projects, I'm just adding the scrap fabric that will match so that I can continue this as I'm going along. This month's block is very similar to a pinwheel. We have the background fabric plus 3 other colors. In their variation, we have the white background fabric with a dark turquoise, a medium green, and this multicolor for the pinwheels. I'm changing it so that my background fabric is going to be this dark multicolor. I'm pulling in a red, a beige, and some fun polka dots. To keep myself organized with my fabric, I like to do 2 things. The first thing is I write on the pattern of the colors that I'm going to be using. From there, I mark them with these little pins. These are just flat flower pins that I've used a permanent marker, and I've labeled them A, B, C, background fabric. I have a whole series of the entire alphabet. This will help keep me in order as I go along. For my thread choices, I'm going to be using the bobbin and the top thread the same. And in this case, I'm going to be using a Primo Soft, and the color is called Linen. It's not really stark white. It's very soft, so it's going to blend in with all of the soft colors. For the darker version, I'm going to be using a green. The green is called Mossy Green, but that green is going to blend in with all of the dark backgrounds. It will also blend with the white and the red because it's not a stark black. So looking at colors that you might not necessarily have thought to use sometimes are the best colors, like this Mossy Green. Let's get started with the Rainbow Sorbet color selection. For the background fabric, you're going to need 4 pieces, 2.5 inches by 5.5 inches. 1 square at 6.5 inches, and it's cut diagonally twice. Fabric A, we have 1 2.5 inch square. Fabric B, 6.5 inch square, cut diagonally twice, which will give us our 4 parts. And fabric C, we will need 2 6.5 inch squares, cut diagonally once, and that's going to give us 4 large triangles. I'm going to take all of the cut pieces and I'm going to lay them out so that it looks like the pattern. By laying the block out, it helps me have a better understanding of what the block looks like and how it's going to be assembled. I know that the pieces are not going to match because the seam allowances have not been put in, but this is just helping me visualize it as I'm sewing. The block consists of 4 corners and a center. So I will need to assemble my 4 corners first. So I'm going to take and stack all of my 4 together on one corner. I just keep moving my pins as I rearrange things so that at a glance I know what pieces I'm going to be working with. Now I'm going to be able to follow the directions and put the block together. We're going to sew the B piece and the background fabrics together. Match up the blocks and sew along this edge at 1/4 inch. When you have a choice between starting with a point or a flat edge, it's always easier if you start with the flat edge. The needle will start on this edge and come down. That way you don't have to worry about that point. When the row of stitching is done, you're going to be able to press those seams going towards the darker color. I like to have my fabric well pressed and starched before I start. And by having it starched, I don't need to bring it to the iron. I can just fold it over and it's going to stay, and that's going to help prevent it from stretching. Now we're going to be able to match up the two triangles together. You will notice that the solid triangle is slightly bigger than the two-piece triangle, and that's going to give you an opportunity to square it up. Just line up the tip so you'll have a little bit on the edge. Stitch that 1/4 inch. Once the seam has been stitched, you're going to be able to square this up to a 5.5 inch square. There are two ways you can do it. You can press it open first and then square it up second, or leave it closed and use that stitching line as a guide and use the square up ruler from Eleanor Burns. The markings on the ruler are for the size of the finished squares. So in this case, I'm going to want my 5.5 inch mark. The mark does not go onto the cut edge, but it goes along the stitching line. So it won't matter what your seam allowance is. You're following your threads. There's also a line going from corner to corner. So you're going to be able to take that line up and match it up to your first stitching line when you stitch these two together. So this point is going to come to one of the ends. Once you have your two lines on the ruler matched up with your 2 rows of stitching, you'll be able to just follow the ruler and cut off that extra. With those 2 edges trimmed off, when you open it up, you're going to have a nice point on one side and a perfect 5.5 inch square. Press the seams to the solid block. I do like to take time and trim off the dog ears. The next is going to be taking that background fabric, which is 2.5 inches by 5.5 inches, and sew it on top of the green. So you're going to be making a rectangle, not a square. Press the seams going towards this rectangle. To sew this block together, we're going to need a partial seam. You're going to work your way around this center block, always with this rectangular piece pointing out, and the larger of the triangles coming into the center. So we're going to sew a part seam on one of these ends. And it won't matter which one you start with. Start with putting that square right in the corner of that large triangle. You need to sew the one edge, but only halfway. So if you start up at this top and stitch down, you only need to stitch about half of that block. It is still a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're just not going all the way to the end. When the center block is pressed over, you're going to have that little piece hanging. But we now have one straight edge we're going to be able to put the next block on. This will fix right at the very end. This seam will now match up. I'm going to be able to match it and go from one side right off to the other. When that row is stitched and when you open it up, you will have the next side that will match one of those blocks. We still have that partial seam open. With that row stitched on, we have one more block to put on. If we take this first piece, we're going to be able to fold it back and expose that corner, which will give us a very clean seam to sew these 2 pieces together. With that seam done, we have that final seam to sew. To sew these 2 together, just fold your block right along that edge. You can stitch the seam 2 ways. You can start where you ended and start up a couple of threads and stitch down, and those corners will match. Or you can go from the bottom and stitch up and go over top of a couple of threads. It's whatever you're more comfortable doing. But that edge underneath and the edge on top will match. So what you're doing is you're finishing that partial seam. With that partial seam stitched down, the block is finished. This was the first partial seam, the second sewing line, third, fourth, then that was the finished line. Let's take a look at the scrappy variation. I'm going to start with that red center. These larger triangles were my polka dot fabrics. My B block, which in this case was the green, is now a light color. The background was a big floral print, and the 2.5 by 5.5 inch rectangles. I'm going to be able to sew the blocks together in the same way. The only difference that I'm going to do with this block is instead of pressing the seams towards the bead color, I'm going to press the seams towards the dark. My partial seam started here, so I was able to do all of the blocks the same as the first one. I now have two 12.5 inch blocks finished, the scrappy variation and the rainbow sorbet. Block 4 is now done. I'll put a link in the description so that you can download the patterns and follow along. Thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're sewing next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.